The next lecturer is Robert Topel. Robert Topel is the Isidore Brown and Gladys J. Brown Professor of Urban and Labor Economics at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. Dr. Topel, or Professor Topel, has expertise in the aggregate valuation of medical care and medical research. He will share with us some of these results this morning. Please.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here today. Let me just figure out how this thing works. There we go. I'm going to report on some work that I've done over a number of years with my colleague Kevin Murphy. And the genesis of this was the University of Chicago at one time asked us, you know, what's medical research worth? And they're a self-interested party because they want to get funding for this, and so they wanted to make a case. But we're not being advocates here. We just treated it as an interesting research agenda. So we worked on it for quite a number of years. So the goals that we had, first we want to measure the value of health improvements. That is, how do we value the health improvements that we've received over time? And we're going to use a willingness to pay way of thinking about it, which is the economist's favorite way of thinking of things. We want to expand the measures of economic well-being to include health and medical advances. We're going to try to measure some of the potential gains from future advances. So, for example, if you could reduce mortality from heart disease or cancer or accidents, whatever, by 2%, 5%, 10%, what would that be worth? And then we're going to relate the value of those improvements to methods and costs of allocating health resources. So as you know, in the United States and in most other developed countries, those resources are allocated by third-party payers, and that creates distortions in our behavior about how much we want to consume. It distorts both our consumption decisions, and it distorts our research incentives because it balances things towards cost increasing rather than cost decreasing innovations at the research stage. So here's some data on life expectancy in the United States over time. And this is just taken from pure survival rates that the U.S. has been collecting since back around 1900. You see the spike here in 1919. That's from the pandemic of 1919, and it's calculated as if everybody lived their entire life in that year. And so you didn't want to be spending your whole life in 1919, in other words. But the main story here is that life expectancy has increased dramatically, and not for both men and women. But the other part to take note of is, and I inadvertently cut off the numbers on the right-hand side here, but if you look at remaining life expectancy, residual life expectancy at age 50, starting around 1970, especially for men, that started to increase a lot. And a lot of that's because of a reduction in mortality from heart disease. So what's that kind of thing worth? Let me tell you our basic conclusions. Those historical improvements in life expectancy have been very valuable. You might think of this as a willingness to accept rather than willingness to pay concept, but between 1900 and 2000, well, so let me give you a statistic. In 1900, 18% of newborn males died before their first birthday. By 2000, it wasn't until age 63 that 18% of newborn males had actually died. That's a huge difference in mortality, and that accounts for a lot of the value that people have gotten. So those gains were worth over the century about $1.2 million per person. Now, if you take that $1.2 million and say, well, I don't have $1.2 million to pay for that life expectancy. Well, let me put it another way. If we said, look, I'll give you $1.2 million if you'll go back and have the health and longevity and stuff that people had in 1900, or you can just live the way you are today, what would you take? Well, if you think it's a close call, then you think that number's a pretty good estimate. So we also find that the uncounted production of health capital accounts for about 25% of GDP. It's bigger earlier in the century, so that value is accumulating rapidly as mortality rates went down. The 1970 to 2000 gains alone are worth in aggregate about 95 trillion to current and future generations, because as knowledge is produced, future generations are going to be able to benefit from that longevity too. So this is a present value calculation. So here's the time series of how that 1.2 million accumulated for men and women. And there's 1919 back there again, where you didn't want to be alive in that year you didn't want to spend your life in 1919. But it converges to 1.2 million. The men catch up at the end because the relative gains in longevity for men were higher towards the end of the century. So the potential future gains are also very large. We calculate that if you were to cure cancer, that would be worth $47 trillion to current and future generations of Americans. And that's, again, a present value calculation, because you have to build in not just that if you cure it for the existing generations, that knowledge is going to cure it for future generations as well. So you have to calculate that as a present value. Heart disease is worth roughly the same amount of money. So it implies that even modest progress has great value. When I've been in some of these conferences with doctors and you say to them, if we gave you a bunch of money, could you reduce mortality from cancer by 10%? And invariably, and I believe them, they say, yeah, we can do that. All right. So these are kinds of improvements that are on the radar screen in terms of research potential. So the other point, historical reduction in heart disease from 1970 to 2000, worth about 35 trillion. That's about 2.5 years current GDP. It doesn't count the public goods spillovers. Others gain from valuable advances in the U.S. So if we produce medical knowledge in the United States, and medical knowledge is a public good, then it's going to improve it's going to improve health, not just in the U.S. but worldwide. So we're not counting the other values when we talk about this stuff. So we also relate this to the cost of care. Investments in research are small by comparison to these gains. It's about $50 billion a year after the expansion in the NIH budget in the 2000s in the U.S., and it accounts for about 3.5% of direct health expenditures. But the potential gains from medical research are quite large. But you don't want to misread that, because they can be because of the distortions we have, partly because of the distortions we have in the way we pay for things. Those gains can be offset by increased costs of care. And I sometimes describe this as, if we could reduce cancer mortality by 10% by hooking everybody up to their own personal nuclear reactor, well, then that's going to be a fairly expensive way of achieving the goal. But if you can do it in a little pill, and it's got low marginal cost, then maybe we're talking about something worthwhile. So the cost of implementing these innovations is really important, and it's more important than the direct expenditures on research. I'm going to give you an example a little bit later. So we need to focus more on the outputs of research rather than simply the inputs. And those distortions in use, because of third-party payers and so on, affect the value of innovations and how we want to use whether it's worthwhile investing in research. So here's our basic method. The value of a statistical life, and I'm not going to go into the details of how the people who do this kind of thing achieve this, but is roughly about 6.3 million. That means that if you could reduce the probability of dying by 1 in 10,000 in a sample of 10,000 people, you'd save one statistical life per year. And willingness to pay that they get off of occupational differences in incomes and other ways of measuring this thing come up with a value of about 6.3 million. So that's the value that the Environmental Protection Agency uses in cost-benefit analyses. Now from that, we're going to infer willingness to pay for life years. What's a life year worth to the person living it? And while Ed was talking, I kind of recognized some of the equations up there, because once an economist starts writing this down, you inevitably get the same thing. So it's the flow of consumer surplus on the income and consumption that people get over their lifetimes. So that's going to yield a life cycle pattern of the value of a life year. So the $6.3 million represents what's the value of a statistical life. Well, that's kind of the integral of the value of each life year, the sum of all those life years from any point during your life. Now, if you could live one more year at age 35 or at age 85, which one would you choose? If I could give you one more year, well, you know the answer, right? So it's telling you that the years at kind of 35 are more valuable than the years at 85, and there you go. So the yellow figure represents based on observed patterns of consumption and willingness to substitute over time, which generates consumer surplus from living an additional year. The value of a life year, and you'll notice that that goes down over time. You don't have to worry about these two down here. That's just income and consumption over the life cycle. So the yellow curve represents the value of an addition of a life year for a representative individual with a household income on the order of $55,000, I think, in current dollars. So that peaks at about $350,000. So the value of living a year is worth a lot more than the amount you actually consume in that year. Why? Because you get consumer surplus on what you get by being alive is worth much more than what you have to pay to get it in any given year. So here's the value of a remaining life that if we assume 6.3 million value of a statistical life. So it's upwards of 7 million back here at age 30, but it goes down rapidly, both because life years are becoming less valuable, and as you get older, guess what? You got less of them, fewer of them left. So the present value of what's left is getting smaller and smaller. Now, if we put all that stuff together, what all this stuff implies is that, well, as we're getting richer, and Ed referred to this as well, the income elasticity of willingness to pay for health is bigger than one. So it's sort of the ultimate luxury good, if you will. And as we get richer, a larger portion of income is therefore going to be devoted to purchasing health. Income growth raises the value of health innovations, because as we get richer, our willingness to pay for these things goes up, so health advances become more valuable to us. Rich societies are willing to pay more. That means the share of health spending will continue to rise as we get richer. We shouldn't be surprised that it's been going up. Maybe we should be surprised it's going up as fast as it has, but we shouldn't be surprised that it's been going up in advanced societies. And then there's this public good spillover I talked about before. Now, the other thing is that the value of a progress, another implication of this analysis, is that the value of progress against a disease is greatest when the current age is close to, but before the typical age of onset. So as we've gotten older, as the number of older Americans has increased as a fraction of the population, you know, we've gotten a lot more interested in things like cancer, heart disease, and Alzheimer's than we were before, because it's hard to get my 30-year-old daughter to think about this stuff being important. But now, in sort of a public expenditure sense, it is. Now, another point is that we think is really important is what we just call a simple complementarity in terms of willingness to pay. It means that progress against one disease like heart disease is going to increase the value of progress against other diseases. So, you know, you didn't care much about Alzheimer's when you only lived to be 50. But, you know, now we're all going to live to be 85, or most people are going to live to be 85. It becomes a much more important thing on the radar screen, so we're willing to invest more in that. So health advances, in other words, raise the value of further health advances, raise our willingness to pay for further health advances, especially those that are age-related. So here's what we don't do. The value of health improvements is not the contribution to GDP. It's not jobs. When we first started working on this, senators would say, this is all very nice, Professor, but how many jobs will this create in my state or my district or whatever? These are costs. Those aren't benefits. Those are costs. The value is not the additional productivity from longer lives. People care a lot more than that. So if you think about retirees, and so much of the gains in longevity have come at older ages recently. Those are valuable because people like being alive, not because they produce stuff. We don't care about the productivity. We care about the utility that people get or the value they get from their additional life years. So what we do measure is what health and longevity add to individual well-being, and that's what matters to an economist. So here's some just graphs about what the increased longevity for males was worth between 1970 and 2000. You can see that, and we've divided it up into 1970, 1980, 80 to 90, 92. It's kind of evenly distributed. And most of it occurs, the peak value occurs around age 50 and going forward from there. And the reason for that is that much of the gains for men came in advances against heart disease. And so this point where I said the greatest value comes when you're closest to the onset of the disease, it's the 50-year-olds that really care about that, and the 20-year-olds care less, although they get the present value of those advances when they get to be 50. For women, it's much less evenly distributed. Most of their gains came between 1970 and 1980, and especially for older women out here, there weren't much gains in terms of value of additional life years for between 1990 and 2000. We haven't updated this to the last decade. So let's look at some particular diseases. These are the gains just from reduction in heart disease. So again, it peaks at around age 50 for men. So the cumulative gains were worth about $300,000 per male. In other words, it's that same conceptual experiment. If you wanted to go back to mortality rates from heart disease in 1970, and I say, I'll take you back to there if I can give you $300,000, do you want to take the deal? If you think that $300,000 is the number, then it's going to be a close call. So let me give some caveats to this net gains analysis. We've given just some big numbers. One is that the gains include improvements from a lot of different changes, or not a lot of different margins, not just healthcare. So it's tempting to look at these gains and say, well, boy, healthcare has really done great stuff. But there's been nutrition, there's been public health infrastructure, there's been just, if you want to call it healthcare, that people reduce the rates of smoking and so on. All those things can contribute. We're just counting what value actually occurred, not necessarily what was the output of the healthcare sector. Healthcare costs include a lot of other expenditures than those directed at longevity. And although I haven't looked under the hood of the stuff that Ed was talking about, I assume that that's going to have an important contribution to those results. So the quality of life is not counted. Orthopedics, that you can get your hip replaced, your knee replaced, and so on. All that stuff is costly, and it goes into our medical expenditures, but it doesn't show up in longevity. So we're undercounting in that sense. But we can compare the size of those two important trends, the gain in the value of additional life years versus the increased expenditure on health. And you might guess what the punchline is on that the gain in additional life years between 1970 and 2000 was way bigger than the additional expenditures, in spite of the fact that we're spending so much more on healthcare. So if you look over, I'll just point to the 1970 to 2000 numbers. The increase in expenditures on healthcare accounts for only about 36% of the total increase in the value of additional life years that we received over that period. So, and I'm not claiming that that the increased expenditures is the cause of the increase in longevity. I'm just telling that the value of health that we've received is way bigger than what the additional spending that we engaged in over those 3 decades. So here's some potential gains from future reduction in disease, which is relevant if you want to think about whether it's worth throwing money at these kinds of problems. So we divided things up by diseases, and what matters is the rate at which people die from these diseases and the ages. So if we could reduce mortality from 10% for men for cardiovascular disease, that would be worth on the order of $35,000 willingness to pay at age 50. Cancer is somewhat smaller. You notice here's infectious diseases includes AIDS. And you notice the peak age is back there around age 30. That's because the onset of the disease is much earlier in people's life cycles than things like heart disease and cancer. Here it is for females. You'll notice cancer is relatively more important. It has a peak value in terms of age earlier in the life cycle, but it's still secondary in overall value to reductions in cardiovascular disease. Now, if we break it down, we've done this all kinds of different ways. We broke it out here for reductions in mortality from lots of major diseases. And we don't need to go over the numbers, but from all causes, if you could reduce mortality from all causes by 10%, that would be worth roughly about 18 trillion, or about what is that, about a year and a third's GDP in terms of present value for current and future generations of Americans. And we've published this somewhere. You can admire the numbers at your leisure. But I want to close by talking about the balancing the costs and the benefits. If we think about medical advances, you have to consider both the benefits and the costs. And progress is an important thing, but controlling costs is also a really important thing. So controlling costs, as it turns out, if you think about it, raises the value of medical advances. So if we don't have good ways to control costs, if we don't allocate resources efficiently ex post, then the research that we engage in ex ante to create these health improvements is going to be less valuable, and they might not even be worth engaging in. So the cost containment, efficient use, and medical progress complement one another. So here's an example. Remember back in the Nixon administration, we had a war on cancer. Well, I really didn't go that far, but we had it. So let's suppose we're going to spend $200 billion on a war on cancer. And we got a 50-50 chance of this working. So success means we come up with some new treatments to reduce mortality, and that reduces mortality by 10%. Failure, we just lit the money on fire. Okay, we didn't come up with anything. So the value of success is $5 trillion based on the numbers from above, because we had about roughly $50 trillion for a cure, so 10% is $5 trillion. So what about the costs of care and implementation? Let's think about it. So here's the cost of care. There's two scenarios if we succeed in our war on cancer and coming up with something that reduces mortality by 10%. The good outcome is that the treatment adds $2.5 trillion in cost, because we got to have costs to treat the people who are going to have cancer. So that's 50% of the value of the cost of care. The bad outcome is that the treatment adds $10 trillion. Now, how could it add $10 trillion to something that's only worth $5? Well, it's because it's like in that movie Build It, where they built the baseball field out in Iowa. It's build it and they will come. If we invent it, we're going to use it. It's very difficult to deny care to people in our current healthcare systems. So assume each scenario is equally likely. Then you have three potential outcomes. The first is you got a 50% of failure. That's worth minus $200 billion. You got a 25% chance of good success. That's plus 2.3 trillion, or plus 2.3 trillion, yeah. And a 25% of bad success. That is, you cure the disease with the nuclear reactor story that I told you before. Well, that's worth minus 5.2 trillion. So the expected gain is minus 825 billion. This project is not worthwhile because the costs of treating the disease are going to be so much higher. But let's be a little bit more optimistic. What matters in that calculation? Well, the costs of research are small by comparison to costs and benefits. And making them 100 billion, 300 billion doesn't really matter. Probability of success matters, but it isn't that much. What really matters is that expected cost of care down the road. So if we can do something about that, what can we do to improve things? Well, we can improve the allocation of health resources. We can only allocate these resources in situations where they're actually produce value commensurate with the costs. So let's continue with our example. Suppose we improve our care system and we don't implement if the costs of care are high. We've got this thing that'll cure your cancer, but we're not going to use it because it doesn't produce value commensurate with the costs. Well, now the chance of failure is 75%. But the expected gain is now plus 425 billion because we're able to effectively allocate these resources down the road. So even though the effective failure rate is much higher, now it's worthwhile investing in this project because it was a $200 billion project to try to make this progress against cancer. So the message is that cost containment raises the value of research, eliminating the major downside. So the downside to R&D research and new technologies is not so much failure, it's unaffordable success in the way we currently allocate medical resources. So the distortions downstream affect the allocation of resources, and they also distort R&D incentives. If we're thinking about investing in some new technology, and I know if I succeed in producing some health advance with it, they're going to use it, then there's no reason why I shouldn't put the resources in because people are going to buy it. And that's a big distortion on the research side. That's my build it and they will come message. So how do we get there? Well, the best solution would be to improve incentives and decisions in the delivery system. So then let research follow the efficient allocation of resources. Second best is you change the direction of research to seek lower cost solutions, but that means you have to really manage research in that way and pick winners and losers. But both enhance the case for more research and that research can then be producing significant, substantial net social value. So other economic factors you could think about: value of improvements is rising, population's getting older, so we care much more about advances in healthcare. Incomes are rising, we're getting richer, health is a normal good. It's probably the ultimate luxury good. Past progress raises the value of future progress. We've made progress, so now because of that complementary effect, we're really willing to pay for more. The worldwide market's going to grow enormously, so the total social value of these advances has been rising. So the growing market makes research-intensive, low-cost solutions increasingly attractive because of their scalability. So accelerating research has significant value if you can contain costs. So the bottom line: past improvements have been really valuable, enormous economic value. Potential gains from future reductions are also extremely valuable if we can contain costs. So the results we suggest that we revise upward our estimates of the value of research, but the key thing that's left out of that is it leaves the cost of treatment as the open issue for cost-benefit analysis. And that's the key issue, in my opinion, that we have to think about in deciding whether research is really, greater research expenditure is really worthwhile. Thank you.